Well, good morning and welcome to Zen Live, which I used to call Buddhas in the landfill. And we're still looking for those Buddhas. And yesterday, I've been trying to create a metaphor or a new way of looking at our perennial problem of who am I and how can I end my dissatisfaction and the angst or the anxiety of life, or the negativity I feel, or the pain I feel. Is there an end to that? That should be a question. Buddha asked that question. Is there an end to suffering or a cessation of it? So let's look. Yesterday we talked about the shift in the center on a very large scale. I hope you go back and pick that talk up. But we were talking about why do the young people, and I say young people, the millennials are all of us, but why are people going to the internet and leaving department stores and churches? And department stores and churches used to be the center of the world, particularly if you go back, say, to the 50s and begin to break up in the 60s. But here in Blackstone, the people my age that grew up here, the department store and the church were the centers of the reality. But now the internet is. Something's changed, and we don't really understand why, because we're swimming in the water. I mean, it's like if you're in a pool and the water changes, you don't know it. Or you know something's different, but you don't know what it is because you're not outside of the pool. You'd have to be outside of the pool in order to see what happened to the water or be able to test it with somebody. See, you have to be out, but we're in the pool. We're in the ocean. We're on the train. We're not out, of reality. We're in the stream. So it's very difficult to understand what's happening. And that's really what I work with that. That's my intention, and that's my curse and my blessing, so to speak. So yesterday we were looking at how life used to be anchored in physical places like the local church and the department store. And by the department store, if you remember, well, maybe you don't remember, but back in the 50s, when you went to the department store in the city, it was like going to church. I mean, women dressed up and put on the hats and gloves, and going to the department store was going to shop and to be a consumer. That was a religious exercise, social duty, to be a consumer. And today, we're like the internet has become the new holy roaming internet church. And here, we're interacting with reality instead of just being passively determined by reality. On the internet, you get to create, you get to participate. You're not just a passive consumer like we were here. In the land churches, you go to church, you're kind of like a passive consumer. You sit in the congregation. And at the department store, you consume goods. So this side, the old paradigm was that you were the created. You were the consumer. You watched TV. You didn't interact with TV. But in this world, this new world, we're interacting with it as a co-creator. Instead of being created by God, we are a co-creator with God, in the sense that God is reality and we're co-creating reality. And there's something that is profoundly changed here, and I'm trying to understand what it is, and I hope you're interested too. So let's take a look at how we're moving this forward. And I'm going back to grammar, our old English class, when the teacher put up on the board the structure of the English language, which is the Indo-European language. It all has the same structure of subject, object, or subject, verb, noun. A subject, a noun, does something to another noun. And that's the structure of the, and then you just use that structure to communicate. But there is an assumption there. And the parts of speech, you got your nouns, you got your verbs, you got your adjectives, and you got your adverbs. And it all fits together. And you can go to France or Italy or whatever Indo-European language, and the same structure is gone. But if you go to the Navajo language, it's all verbs, no nouns. What does that mean? How can that happen? You see. And we make the mistake in the West of believing, we just assume that reality fits our grammar. That reality is made up of nouns, and they're all just doing something to other nouns, and we're all a noun. We're all it's, we're all defined. Adam named it all, you see. So let's go back to the basic structure of the three persons of grammar. So we're going to look at the first and the third person. Now the third person is he, she, or it. So everything is a he, she, or an it. And we don't really have a word for a he, she, like transgender. A he, she would be a transgender person, but usually we break it up, he, she, or it, you see. But basically everything's an it. It's an object. Okay, so, and we are aware of objects. And there is a subject. That's a me, that's aware of objects. And the subject is also an it. I'm, have a name, I've got a place, I'm here in Blackstone, I'm a thing, talking to you, you're a thing, listening to me. And you can define me, I can define myself. I've got a history, and we all define ourselves. Who are you? And we have a profile, all my likes, all my dislikes, my values, what I do, what I've done, what I want to do. All that's it. You see, that's the definition of who I am. So this is kind of like an assumed world of it's, and it's a flat world. And it's in time. It's are in time. If you can't have a it, when you have an it, you have time. It's and time go together. It's move around in time. If it's don't move, there's no time. There has to, in order for time to happen, you have to have movement. Time is movement. And you can measure it. It's here, and it went from here to here, and it took so long. It's time, you see. There's movement. And then when it does something to another something, that creates time. That's a verb. But where the other person, if you remember, was the first person, I. And when we write, we usually, we understand then. We can write from the first person and said, I went along here and I did this, and speaking from the first person. Or we're speaking of the third person, which most people write in, which is prose. Prose is the vehicle of the third person. So now I'm writing about myself or writing about someone else as objects who did something. But poetry is the vehicle for the first person. Now, what is the first person is really, if our reality map is just a bunch of it's and nouns, the first person consciousness, I, is a ghost. And science can't find his, although it is working on it now, but science, since the Enlightenment, has never been able to understand or define or even put consciousness on the material map. Even today, scientists will say, well, consciousness is created by the brain. The brain creates consciousness, and what's the brain but an it? So the it creates consciousness, or the first person. But we don't feel that, you see. We don't feel I'm an it. Whenever I'm an it, I'm judged. An it means you're named and defined and you're judged. And we're constantly resisting that. So let's try and look at this 10th man. There is a story in Zen called the 10th man, if I can remember this right. So 10 people go across the river and they get the other side, so oh, we better count to make sure everybody got here. So one person counts, he gets 9 people. We're missing one. Somebody else counts, so we're 9 person. We're missing somebody. So a stranger comes along and said, we're missing somebody. And would you count to see if we're all here? It was supposed to be 10. So he counts and he says, there's 10 people here. But that's not all that we're here. There's still something is meant. That would not be right. Who's missing? If someone else came along and said, oh, that stranger, there's 11 people here. That's wrong too. Who's missing, you see? The 10th man is always missing. The first person is doing the counting, and that is never counted. Because if you count it, it becomes an it. And then there's still another first person. Get the idea? It's always stepping back. You can't turn around and count the first person because the first person is the counter. So if you keep on counting, someone else comes in and counts, they're always wrong because the counter is never counted. The first person cannot turn around and observe itself and say, you're in it. So the first person is always missing. And it's missing from the map of reality. But we constantly stumble into the first person, but we don't really have a map or an understanding so we can awaken to our first person. So let's look at these 2 diagrams here. Is that the diagram of the first person is the circle with a dot in it, and that's the I. And in fact, there are really no boundaries to the first person, because the first person, wherever the first person goes, the first person is the center. This is the definition of God, by the way. A God has been defined as the center of a circle that has no circumference. So the center is always there. If you go to China, the center is there. A good example of this is the GPS map. In the GPS map, you're always in the center. And if you move, the world moves around you. And if you keep zooming out, there's no end to your zoom. You can zoom out in infinity. You see, so the center is the irreducible spot, but you can never turn around and see it, because if you turn around and see it, then the seer is not the center again. You see what I mean? You get an idea here? What we're looking at here, from the first person view, the center is the tent pole of the tent of reality, which moves like on a GPS map wherever it goes. So it's always in the center. And this, by the way, is the paradigm of the internet. If you're on a cell phone, wherever you go, you're on the internet, you're in the center of the internet. That little cell phone is the center of the internet. And everything goes out like that, you see. You're at the center. And this is the primary yearning of the first person, to be at the center of the universe as the one without a second. The first person has no second, because if there's a second, it becomes an it. So the first person has no second. And the first person has no time. The first person has no dimension. The first person is always at the center as the knower of all the its. And the knower can never be an it. The knower cannot be an it, because if you know the knower, there's still a knower of the knower. So it's always moving back. You can't catch it. You can't turn around and catch yourself. You can't see your first person, but you know it's there. You know it's there. So this is the undefined. The first person is the ghost in the machine. It's the knower, and it is also the unknown, because you can't turn around and know the person, your personhood, as an it. And this is the ambiguity of consciousness. consciousness is ambiguous because we are a first person and we are a third person. Both at the same time, yet we're separate. So we're constantly, this is the yin-yang symbol, the I of the first person and the third person are kind of like chasing each other, trying to restore unity. So it's kind of like our consciousness is split into I and it, you see, and they are chasing each other like, like the, my favorite symbol is the snake eating itself. So consciousness is constantly chasing itself to become one, but it's two. So it can't do it. So it keeps, we're constantly oscillating back and forth between first person and third person. A good example of a shift in first person and third person is when you go to, you pick up a book. Now, when you go into the bookstore, you're in the third person. Oh, there's a book, it. There's me as an it, subject. I'm aware of myself as a person, an object. I'm going into the bookstore, it's full of objects. I see an object. I want that object, so I get the object, and I sit down, open the book. And then when I enter into the book, I am no longer in the third person. That dissolves and goes away. Now I am, I am as the book. I am as the story. And it's like going into a movie. The third person me vanishes. Now there is a first person, a knower, and I'm in this book, as the story. And then if somebody taps me on the shoulder and says, excuse me, but which way is this? Suddenly I'm back into me, and I get a little irritated because I like being in the book, you see. I liked having a vacation from this split between me and objects, this separation. So we're constantly moving in and out of this, the structure of our consciousness that we can really, help understand by our grammar. The second person we'll pick up another time because we can get into the second person, which is kind of like is I, you, but it's a unity. You is not an it in the second person. So it's I, thou. And a good example of the second person in which the I and the it are one would be romantic love. When in romantic love, we have another person as an it, but I am the it and the other person is me. So there is a union of the first person in the second person relationship, you see, where I and the other person are one, yet two. But we'll pick up that later. Right now we're just trying to get an idea of why the first person is so elusive, and we are really in a search for the lost person. When the first person awakens, this is what Zen Buddhism is all about. Buddhism is about the awakening of the first person. When the I awakens as the center of reality, of the world, there is a lion, it's called the lion's roar. It's the awakening of the first person. And it's always sudden, it's always life-changing, and it's called a spiritual experience. It's called Satori or Kensho, salvation, rebirth, all the names, self-individuation, self-realization. Self-realization is the realization of the person as I, as the center of the world, yet at the same time, also as third person. These two have to go together. If they don't, you fall into narcissism, egomania, In other words, when the first person awakens, and they're not able to hold the ambiguity together of first and third person, you get an exploding or expanding ego. It's called a spiritual ego. And then I'm God, you see. I am the one without a second. But that is a fallacy, or that is just a higher state of ignorance, you see. But anyway, so the idea we are working with here is that the first person in our reality map of the Western civilization, which is a map of its, the scientific method works with its, has eliminated or failed to actualize the first person. So all of the New Age, all of the influx of Eastern teachings that came in with the 60s has been, over the centuries, leaking into this Western view of the world, this objective map, and then it burst in full bloom in the 60s with Zen and yoga and the gurus and all of this first-person philosophy, first-person actualization, you see. And then it just burst into it. And the hippie movement, if you think of just these flowers bursting into it, was a first-person bloom. And we're still doing that now. And the internet is a first-person bloom too. Because on the internet is like a metaphor for the first person blooming. Because on the internet, as I said, and we'll close with this, you are not you are the creator, which is the first person, and you are the created, which is the third person. So on the internet, we're interactive with the internet reality as a co-creator, not as the created. That's why we love it. And that is increasing. Everything is interactive now. Twitter is an interactive medium. News TV, everything is interactive with Twitter, social media, Facebook. Everything is interactive. And that is a metaphor, it's an electronic world. I mean, if the power goes off, boom, the world goes away. It's not a real world. It's a metaphorical world. It's a reflection of reality that has no place for the first person. So in our search for the first person, the lost person, we created an electronic world in which the first person can play and actualize itself and pretend it's real. But it's an artificial world, you see. So it's not, and it's artificial because it's dependent upon electrical power. So if the power goes off, the internet goes off, and we feel like I'm lost, I'm disconnected. Oh my God. You see, this is cast into purgatory. I'm back in the land. I'm back into the flat world where I'm just an it. Everybody's an it here. On the internet, I'm not an it. I can be something on the internet. I can be a first-person creator. So I hope this, we're grappling with this change in paradigms. And the topic of today is the search for the lost person, which is the answer to the question, who am I? What am I? And we'll pick this up in our next talk. So, drop in this evening at martini time.